The body was still warm when they found Luca Carboni's double. It had taken Marco Vitelli, the syndicate's head of security, exactly 4 hours to locate the man after Luca Carboni, patriarch of the Carboni crime family, undisputed sovereign of the New York underworld, had been shot twice in the chest on the rain-slicked rooftop of the Meridian Hotel. 4 hours of frantic calls, encrypted messages, and one very expensive private investigator before a name surfaced from the gutter. Nico Reyes, 26 years old, failed stage actor, currently performing dinner theater in a second-rate venue in Queens, where he played various roles in productions no one attended. The resemblance was, in Marco's words, a gift from God or the devil, and I've stopped pretending there's a difference. Nico didn't know any of this when 2 men in black suits arrived backstage at the Paramount Supper Club on a Thursday night. He was still in costume, a theatrical count from some forgotten 19th-century melodrama, with grease paint on his collar and a half-eaten sandwich in his hand when the taller man held up a photograph. It was a photograph of Luca Carboni at some charity gala. Black tuxedo, square jaw, the kind of sculpted stillness that came from either aristocratic breeding or relentless violence. Cold, dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Hair swept back from a widow's peak. A particular way of holding himself, spine straight, chin slightly elevated, as though the world existed at a slight angle beneath him. Nico Reyes stared at the photograph for a long moment. Then he looked up into the taller man's face. "Interesting," he said. "That's one word for it," said the man. They drove him uptown in a car that cost more than Nico's entire apartment building. He asked twice where they were going and received no answer either time, which told him something about the kind of men he was dealing with. He noted the weight of the silence, not hostile exactly, more like the silence of people who had already made a decision and were simply waiting for the subject of that decision to catch up. He wasn't afraid. That surprised him slightly. He'd always thought of himself as a cowardly person in the specific, private way that people are when they've never been truly tested. But something about the night, about the photograph, about the cold clarity of the men in suits, it bypassed the part of his brain that should have been screaming and settled into something older, something that recognized the shape of a story. The car stopped in front of a building on Park Avenue whose lobby contained more marble than some Italian cathedrals. A private elevator brought them to the 42nd floor. The doors opened into a penthouse that occupied the entire upper level, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city in every direction, the skyline burning in the dark like something that had never learned how to die. There were 6 people in the room. 4 of them Nico couldn't read. Older men in expensive clothes, faces like closed books. The 5th was Marco Vitelli himself, whom Nico had not yet met but would come to know in the weeks ahead as a man made entirely of pragmatism and old debts. The 6th person stood at the window with her back to the room. She was tall, dressed in a deep navy gown that suggested she'd been pulled from somewhere formal and hadn't yet changed. Her dark hair was up in a style both elegant and slightly undone, as though the evening had begun perfectly and then lost its way. Her shoulders were straight, but there was something in the set of them, a tension held so precisely it could only be grief. She did not turn when Nico entered. Marco stepped forward. "Sit down." Nico sat. "You know who Luca Carbone is?" "I've heard the name." "Then you know what he controls." "Controlled," said Nico. "Past tense, I'm guessing, since you're here talking to me instead of him." Something shifted in the room. The 4 older men exchanged glances. Marco's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. And the woman at the window? She turned, finally, and looked at him for the first time. Her eyes were dark. Not like Luca's had been in the photograph. His had been cold, geological. Hers were dark the way deep water is dark, full of something moving beneath the surface. She looked at Nico the way a person looks at a wound they're trying to assess before they let themselves feel it. She said nothing. Marco said, "Luca Carbone was shot at approximately 10:15 this evening by persons unknown. He died on arrival at the hospital. As of this moment, 4 rival organizations are watching our every move. We have a board meeting in 72 hours, a shipment coming through the port in 5 days, a federal grand jury that has been building a case against the family for 3 years. He paused. "We need Luca Carboni to be alive." "You need a ghost," Nico said. "We need an actor." Nico looked around the room. He looked at the city through the windows, all that light, all that noise, all those millions of people going about the business of living lives that would never intersect with this room, this conversation, this specific gravity. He looked at the woman by the window, who was still watching him with those deep, careful eyes. He thought about his apartment in Queens, the water stain shaped like Italy on his ceiling, the sandwich, the grease paint. "What happens to me," he said slowly, "if I say no?" Marco smiled. It was not a warm smile. "I think you're smart enough to understand that you were never really asked." And that was how Nico Reyes died, and Luca Carbone walked out of the elevator. They gave him 3 days to become a dead man. The penthouse was his prison and his school. Marco brought in Luca's personal tailor at 6 in the morning of the first day, a thin, nervous man named Augusto, who measured Nico's body with the reverence of someone dressing a saint and the efficiency of someone who understood that saints were simply men until they weren't. The suits were Luca's, Brioni, bespoke, cut to a specific architecture of authority. When Nico put on the first one, something happened to his spine. It straightened. The cloth was so precisely fitted that poor posture became physically uncomfortable. He understood then that luxury was its own kind of cage. Marco stood behind him at the mirror and watched. "The way you hold your hands," Marco said. "Luca never gestures when he speaks. He lets the silence do the work. I'm an actor. Stillness is harder than movement. Then earn it." There were files, hundreds of them, printed and organized in leather binders by a woman Marco called simply the archivist, who never entered the room herself. Nico read through the night. Luca's history, his alliances, his grudges, the particular hierarchies of the 5 families, and where the Carbones sat within them. The names of every soldier, capo, and consigliere. The names of the rivals. The names of the dead. The names of the living. On the second morning, Marco brought in 3 men who had worked closely with Luca, close enough to have opinions about whether this substitution would survive more than 10 minutes under scrutiny. They were told Luca had suffered a head injury in the shooting, a credible lie, thin enough to explain certain behavioral changes while buying the performance time to settle. The first man was a capo named Sal Donati, heavy-set, quick-eyed, with the particular wariness of someone who had survived 3 decades in a profession where longevity was not guaranteed. He walked into the room and stopped 3 feet in front of Nico, who was seated at the head of the dining table in one of Luca's suits with a glass of water in his hand. Nico met his eyes, held them, said nothing. It was a technique Nico had been practicing for 30 hours, the profound, weaponized stillness of a man who had never needed to prove anything to anyone because the proof was in their fear. He learned it not from Marco's instructions, but from a memory, a director he'd worked with years ago who'd said that the most dangerous character in any room is the one who isn't trying. Sal looked at him for a long, suspended moment. Then he lowered his eyes slightly, the specific lowering that was not quite a bow but carried the same information. "Boss," he said. The other 2 passed similarly. Only Marco watched Nico afterward with something that had begun to look, cautiously, like respect. It was on the second evening that the woman came to him. He was standing at the window. He'd developed a habit of it, the view helping him think, when the elevator opened and she walked in without announcement. She wore black. She'd changed from the navy gown into something quieter, more private, and her hair was down now. She carried herself with a deliberateness that suggested she'd made a decision on the way up and wasn't interested in reconsidering it. Her name, he'd learned, was Valentina Greco, 24 years old, daughter of Enzo Greco, head of the Greco family in Chicago, a man of significant power and colder ambitions. The engagement to Luca Carbone had been announced 6 months ago. It was a political arrangement. Enzo Greco's access to East Coast ports in exchange for the Carbone's protection of certain Chicago operations. Valentina had not been consulted. She had agreed, which Marco described as pragmatic, and which Nico suspected was something more complicated. She stood 10 feet from him and looked at him the way she had that first night, that deep, measuring assessment. "You blinked too fast when Sal came in," she said. Nico said nothing. Luca never blinked. He had this way of looking at people like they were objects he was deciding whether to keep. She paused. You look like a person trying not to show fear. That's different. I wasn't afraid. No, she said. You were concentrating. Which is almost worse, because concentration is visible if you know what to look for. She crossed the room and stopped in front of him, with perhaps 4 feet between them. Up close, she was more striking than beautiful in the conventional sense. Her beauty was structural, architectural, the kind that came from bone and bearing rather than softness. Her dark eyes were doing that thing again, moving like water below the surface. I know what Luca looked like when he was thinking. You don't look like that. Nico watched her. You loved him. Something crossed her face. Not the thing he'd expected, which was grief. It was something older and more complicated. I knew him, she said carefully. That isn't the same thing. No, he agreed. They stood in the silence of that admission for a moment. Marco has told me, she said finally, that I'm to continue the engagement, that our arrangement should appear unchanged, that you and I will be seen together at the appropriate events, say the appropriate things. She lifted her chin slightly. I want you to understand that I will do this. I will do what is necessary. But I will not pretend with you. Not here, in private. That's the one thing I'm asking for. No performance, Nico said. No performance. He nodded. She turned to go, then stopped. What's your name? Your real one. He thought about it. The question had more weight than it should have. Nico, he said. She nodded once, as though filing it away. I'm Valentina. I know. No, she said, and something shifted in her voice. Something that sounded almost like the first crack in ice. You know who Luca was engaged to. That's not the same thing as knowing me. She left. And Nico stood at the window for a long time, thinking that she was, very probably, the most dangerous person in this building. The board meeting happened in a room that smelled of old money and older grudges. The Carbone family's inner sanctum occupied the entire 3rd floor of a building they owned outright in Midtown. Marble floors, dark wood paneling, the kind of lighting that flattered power without flattering faces. 12 men sat around an oval table whose wood was so old it had nearly fossilized. They were all looking at Nico. Nico had barely slept. He sat at the head of the table in Luca's chair, a piece of furniture that somehow communicated more authority than its physical dimensions should have allowed, with Marco at his right hand and Sal Donati at his left. He had studied the agenda. He had memorized the names. He had spent 4 hours in front of a mirror, not practicing expressions, but practicing their absence, working toward the particular blankness that Marco described as Luca's thinking face, and which Nico had begun to understand was not blankness at all, but a very specific kind of intensity turned inward. The head of the family's legal operations, a man named Carmine De Luca, opened with the obvious. The incident at the Meridian. We need to address who pulled the trigger. Nico let the silence run 3 seconds. He'd counted in rehearsal, 3 seconds being the exact interval between a normal person's response time and the response time of someone who has decided the question doesn't deserve urgency. We address it, he said, when we know the answer. Not before. His voice was lower than natural. He'd been working on that, dropping into a register that lived in his chest rather than his throat. Luca, according to the recordings Marco had shown him, had spoken with the precise, unhurried cadence of a man who'd never been interrupted in his life. Carmine's eyes flickered. The Sorrento family is not confirmed. Another beat of silence. Speculation at a table like this is how mistakes get made. We wait for intelligence, then we act. Carmine sat back. 3 seats down, a man named Petrov, the family's connection to certain Eastern European operations, leaned forward slightly. Nico had been warned about Petrov specifically. He was the sharpest man in this room. He had known Luca Carbone for 11 years. You seem, Petrov said, in his careful, lightly accented English, different today. Nico met his eyes. I was shot at last week. You were not hit. The bullet hit close enough. It wasn't a great line, but it was delivered with enough flat certainty that Petrov seemed to weigh it, then let it go. The meeting continued. Nico spoke only when necessary, and mostly in the form of directives, short, declarative, inarguable. He'd learned from Luca's recordings that the real power in that voice wasn't in the content, but in the tone, which communicated at all times that the conversation was happening because he was permitting it, not because he required it. By the time the meeting ended, he was shaking, not visibly, but his hands, below the table level, trembled with the sustained adrenaline of 2 hours of performance under the most high-stakes audition of his life. He waited until the room had emptied, until Marco had gone to deal with something in the hallway, until he was alone. He sat back in the chair and let out a breath that felt like it had been stored for years. The door opened. Valentina slipped in. She'd been waiting in an anteroom, available if needed, invisible if not. She closed the door behind her and looked at him from across the room. "Petrov almost had you," she said. "I know." Luca would have smiled at him. The very small smile, the one that means, "I know something you don't, and I'm choosing not to tell you yet." He used it to unsettle people. Nico filed it away. "Why are you helping me?" She was quiet for a moment. "Because if you fail," she said, "the alternatives are worse. For everyone." It was the honest answer. He respected it even as something in him, the part that was still Nico, that had always wanted things to be more than transactional, felt a small, private ache at it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, moved to leave. "Valentina." She stopped. "You were watching the whole time." "Yes." "Were you worried?" She turned slightly, enough that he could see her profile, the clean line of her jaw, the deliberate composure of her expression. "I was invested," she said. "Those are different things." She left. Nico sat in the chair for another minute. Then he picked up the glass of water on the table and held it until his hands stopped shaking. Later that afternoon, the story went out through the family's networks. Don Carbone had been targeted. Don Carbone had survived. Don Carbone was conducting business as usual. The city believed it, and somewhere in the gap between what the city believed and what was true, Nico Reyes began to understand the particular terror of becoming someone else. Valentina moved into the penthouse on a Thursday. It was, they told her, a matter of optics. The engagement needed to be visible and consistent. The Don's fiancé needed to be in residence. She packed what she needed from her suite at the Carlyle in 2 hours and arrived at the Park Avenue building with 4 bags and an expression that made the staff inexplicably reluctant to make eye contact. She was assigned rooms in the East Wing, a suite with its own entrance to the main living space, a bedroom with a view of the East River, and, on clear mornings, a thin strip of blue sky between the buildings that reminded her of something she couldn't name. She unpacked with methodical efficiency. She did not decorate. She did not put photographs on the dresser. This was not, she told herself, a home. But the man who was supposed to be in the rooms across the hall made it something stranger than she'd prepared for. She found him at 7 in the morning, the day after she moved in the kitchen, a vast, restaurant-quality space that the actual Luca Carbone had rarely entered. Standing barefoot at the stove, in dark trousers and a white undershirt, attempting to make coffee with a machine so expensive and Italian-designed that it required something approaching an engineering degree. He hadn't heard her come in. He was frowning at the machine with an expression of genuine, earnest bafflement that was so entirely unlike anything Luca Carbone had ever looked like that Valentina stopped in the doorway and simply stared. Then he pressed the wrong button, and steam erupted from a valve with a sound like a small explosion, and he stepped back and said, in a completely normal, non-Mafia Don voice, "Oh, for the love of—" Valentina made a sound. He spun around. They looked at each other. "There is," she said carefully, "a coffee service. You press the button on the panel by the window, and someone brings coffee." "I know that," he said, and then, after a pause, "I didn't want to press the button." "Why not?" He seemed to think about this with more seriousness than the question warranted. "Because pressing a button and having someone immediately appear with coffee is—" He stopped, started again. "I've been making my own coffee for 26 years. The idea of just summoning it feels strange." Valentina looked at him for a long moment. This was the thing that had been accumulating since the first night. The small wrongnesses. Not mistakes exactly. He hadn't made any mistakes that mattered, not yet. But these moments of accidental authenticity. These gaps in the performance where something else showed through. Something that was not Luca. Something she didn't have a name for yet. She crossed the kitchen, studied the machine for approximately 4 seconds, pressed 2 buttons in sequence, and coffee began to dispense into the carafe. "Oh," said Nico. "There's a manual in the drawer," she said. "I didn't look for a manual." Luca would have had someone shot for owning a machine that required a manual. She said it flatly, as a simple fact, and turned to get a cup from the cabinet. When she turned back, he was looking at her with an expression she recognized. It was the look of someone hearing something as ordinary that they had previously had to treat as extraordinary. The way people from difficult childhoods react when someone casually describes a functional family moment. "Did you like him?" Nico asked. "Luca?" Valentina poured her coffee. She considered lying, then remembered her own rule about performance. "He was what he was," she said. "Clear, consistent. He didn't pretend to be something he wasn't, which I respected, even when what he was made my skin crawl." She sipped her coffee. "He treated me like a transaction, which was honest at least." Nico was quiet. "How long," he said, "were you engaged?" 6 months. We had dinner 5 times. 3 of them were formal events. The other 2 were assessments, I think is the right word. He was deciding whether I was a liability. She sat down at the kitchen island. I passed, apparently. "You don't sound—" He stopped. "Bitter?" I was going to say sad. She looked at her coffee. "I was never under any illusions about what it was," she said. "That's the advantage of a family like mine. No one dresses things up." "That sounds lonely." The word landed differently than she'd expected. Not with sympathy exactly. There was nothing pitying in his voice. Just a simple, direct acknowledgement, the way you might note that the sky was cloudy. She looked up at him. He wasn't watching her with Luca's cold, geological stare. He was watching her the way a person watches something they're genuinely trying to understand, with attention that had warmth in it, an interest that wasn't strategic. It was, she thought, the most dangerous thing about him. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" "Look at me like that." His brow furrowed. "Like what?" "Like I'm—" She stopped. She didn't have the right word. "Like I'm a person rather than a position. Like my loneliness is something you actually care about." "Like you're not him," she said instead. He understood. The warmth in his eyes didn't disappear exactly, but it organized itself, became more careful. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't apologize either. Luca never apologized." "I know." A pause. "I'm still sorry." She drank her coffee and didn't answer that. But she stayed, and they sat in the kitchen in a silence that was different from the silence in the board meeting, different from any silence she'd known in this world. A silence that had something tentative and human in it, like the first light after a long dark. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself this several times, with some conviction. The Onyx was the Carbone family's most visible, legitimate business. A nightclub on the Upper West Side that occupied 3 floors of a converted 19th century theater and was, on any given night, the most photographed square footage in New York. It was where the powerful went to be seen, and where the dangerous went to be photographed, looking like merely the powerful. Luca had attended every Thursday without fail, which meant Nico attended. The preparation was its own ritual. The suit, Brioni, charcoal, was laid out by someone whose job it apparently was to lay out suits. The car waited downstairs at 11. The security detail, 4 men, 2 in front and 2 behind, moving through space with the practiced invisibility of people trained to be noticed only when necessary, assembled in the lobby. Nico stood in the bathroom of the penthouse at 10:50 and looked at himself in the mirror. He had been doing this every day, this specific mirror check, this inventory of the person looking back. What was frightening was not how unlike himself he looked. It was how much, incrementally and with gathering speed, the reflection had begun to seem natural. The door to the ensuite bathroom was open, and through it he could see the bedroom and, beyond that, the hallway. Valentina appeared in the hallway at 10:53, in a dress the color of deep red wine. Floor length, split to the thigh, with a neckline that was elegant rather than provocative, and somehow managed to be more devastating for it. Her hair was loose and dark against the fabric, and she wore, at her throat, a necklace that Nico recognized from a file photograph as having belonged to Luca's mother. She stopped when she saw him looking. "The necklace was in the jewelry case in my room," she said. I assumed I was expected to wear it. You were, he said. You should. He came out of the bathroom, and they stood in the bedroom doorway. Two people dressed as power, as wealth, as a unit, and looked at each other with the particular awareness of people who know that the show is about to start. Stay close, he said. Not because... He stopped. Not because Luca would want you close to your fiancé, she finished, but because you'll want to watch my eyes. He blinked. I know these people, she said. My family has been doing this my whole life. I'll tell you in a look if someone's wrong, if someone is watching too hard, if the smile doesn't reach the eyes. She paused. You watch the room, I'll watch the people. A team, he said. A survival mechanism. The onyx received them like a body receives blood, seamlessly, inevitably, as though the night had been organized around their arrival. The crowd parted. The music shifted slightly, some atmospheric recalibration toward the ceremonial. Faces turned. Nico walked. He walked the way he'd practiced, with the unhurried certainty of someone who owned not just the building, but the gravity inside it. At his side, Valentina moved with a grace so practiced it looked effortless, her hand lightly at his arm, her expression composed into something between cool warmth and calculated radiance. They were very good together. He realized this with a slight shock, the specific shock of discovering a talent you hadn't auditioned for. The first hour was a performance of pleasantries so precisely managed it could have been choreographed. Men greeted him with deference. Women greeted Valentina with the particular wariness of people acknowledging that she outranked them. He said very little. He let the silence work, the way Marco had taught him. It was at the private bar on the second floor, a narrow, dark-paneled room accessible only to the family's inner circle, that things got complicated. A man named Dominic Farrow was there. Nico had memorized the file. Dominic Farrow, 32, cousin to the Sorrento family's current head, which made him a person of significant interest in the investigation into Luca's assassination. He had the loose, confident manner of someone who had always inhabited spaces a size too large for him and had learned to spread out to fill them. He was handsome in a calculated, deliberate way, and he was watching Valentina with the specific attention of someone who had watched her before and planned to continue. Nico felt something he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't jealousy, or he told himself it wasn't, which amounted to the same thing. It was colder and more structural than jealousy. It was the rage of ownership, which was its own kind of shame. Valentina, to her credit, noticed and kept her expression perfectly calibrated, but she moved, very slightly, closer to him. He read it correctly. This was the signal. This was the eyes he'd been told to watch. He turned to Farrow with the flat, geological stare he'd been practicing. Dominic, he said. Farrow's easy smile didn't waver. Don Carbone, you look... A pause, calculated. Well, considering... I am considering, Nico said. A number of things. Let it hang. Farrow's smile became more precise, the smile of someone recalculating. Of course. He turned to Valentina. Valentina, you look extraordinary, as always. As always? Nico said. The words came out with a quietness that was more alarming, structurally, than any raised voice could have been. Farrow looked back at him. Something moved behind his eyes, the specific shadow of a man who has just realized he was more exposed than he thought. A figure of speech, Farrow said. Nico smiled, the small smile, the one Valentina had described, the one that meant, I know something you don't, and I'm choosing not to tell you yet. He moved on. In the elevator going up to the private level, with the doors closed and 2 security men outside, Valentina turned to him. That was exactly right, she said quietly. I know, he said, and was surprised to find that it wasn't pride he felt. It was something quieter and colder, the recognition that he had frightened a man, and that the frightening had been effective, and that effectiveness in this world was not something you were supposed to examine too closely. Farrow was at the Meridian the night of the shooting, he said. Valentina's expression didn't change. I know. You know a great deal. I've been in this world my whole life, she said. My father made sure of it. She looked at him steadily. Intelligence is the only currency I've ever been allowed to earn for myself. The elevator reached their floor. The night continued. 2 weeks into his performance, Nico began to understand the texture of the life he was inhabiting, not just the gestures and the silences and the particular weight of a name that made rooms reorganize themselves, the substance, the machinery, the way the Carbone operation worked, the layers of it, the architecture of loyalty and threat and obligation that had been built over 3 generations. Marco became, somewhat to Nico's surprise, something approaching a teacher. Not a kind teacher. Marco Vitelli was a man who had spent 40 years in proximity to power by making himself indispensable and unemotional, and he communicated information the way a machine dispenses ice, in measured quantities, at controlled temperatures, without ceremony. But he was thorough, and he had understood, with characteristic pragmatism, that the most dangerous variable in this equation was Nico's ignorance. The Chicago situation, Marco said, one morning over documents in the study, a room lined with books that the real Luca had, by all accounts, never opened. Valentina's father, he'll want a meeting. When? Within the month. He'll come here or he'll send someone. Either way, he'll be testing. For? Everything. Competence, control, whether his daughter is being treated according to the terms of the agreement. A pause. Whether you're worth what the agreement promised. Nico thought about this. What did the agreement promise? Marco's expression was careful. Luca was a specific kind of man. Enzo Greco valued that. The partnership was built on a mutual understanding of ruthlessness as a shared language. He looked at Nico steadily. You are not a ruthless man. No. Which means you'll need to seem like one in ways that count. He slid a folder across the desk. Luca's methodology with the Greco family. Study it. Nico studied it. In the evenings, in the hours after the business of performance had ended and before the performance of sleep began, he and Valentina occupied the penthouse with the careful courtesy of 2 people who have agreed on boundaries and are slightly surprised to find themselves respecting them. She cooked, sometimes. Not elaborate things. She had the unsentimental efficiency of someone who'd learned to cook as a practical skill rather than a domestic one. But occasionally he'd come into the kitchen to find her at the stove, with her hair loose and her shoes off, doing something to pasta that smelled like Rome in a different life. And the sight of it did something to the interior of his chest that he didn't examine. He read, constantly, the books that lined the study, which turned out to have been curated by Luca's late mother, and ran heavily toward 20th century Italian literature and, surprisingly, poetry. He found himself genuinely absorbed, which embarrassed him slightly. He was supposed to be studying crime. He was reading Pavese. Luca never read those, Valentina said one evening, appearing in the doorway of the study to find him with a book. She seemed genuinely surprised, not alarmed, just surprised, which was almost better. I know, he said. You shouldn't leave them on the desk. If Marco sees... Marco has eyes everywhere. Marco has probably already seen. She leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, studying him. What are you reading? He held up the spine. She was quiet for a moment. Then, in a voice that carried something he hadn't heard from her before, something unguarded and almost young. My mother read that, before she got sick. He put the book down. I'm sorry. She died when I was 11, said matter-of-factly. Not coldly. Valentina rarely deployed coldness for its own sake, but with the flat precision of someone who has long since made peace with the fact and is simply reporting it. My father raised me after, which is why I am the way I am. Which way is that? She looked at him, that deep water look. Useful, she said. Strategic. Capable of surviving in rooms designed to exclude me. That sounds like armor, not a person. Something moved across her face, fast and gone. What's the difference? The armor comes off. The silence that followed was of the electric kind, charged, not comfortable, not uncomfortable. She uncrossed her arms. You're different, she said. It wasn't accusatory. It wasn't even quite an observation. It was more like she was thinking aloud, or thinking at him. Than Luca. Than anyone I've met in this world. She paused. You are... She seemed to be choosing the word with the same care she applied to everything. Kind, Not as a strategy, just as a condition. Is that bad? In this world? Catastrophically. She looked at him a moment longer. But you're still here. So. She left the doorway. He didn't immediately go back to his book. He sat in Luca Carboni's study, surrounded by Luca Carboni's dead mother's books, wearing Luca Carboni's clothes, and thought about a woman who described herself as useful and armored, and had looked at him for one unguarded second, like she was trying to remember the shape of something she'd lost. He thought that was probably the most dangerous thing that had happened since the men in black suits arrived backstage at the Paramount Supper Club. He thought it again the next morning, making coffee, correctly, with the machine, when she came into the kitchen in a silk robe and bare feet and said good morning without looking at him, in the casual, unself-conscious way of someone beginning to feel at home. He thought, this is how it happens. Not with violence, not with schemes, with morning coffee and bare feet and a woman who reads the same books her dead mother read. He thought he was in terrible trouble. The intelligence on the Meridian assassination came in on a Wednesday. Nico was in the war room, a term he'd coined privately for the secure conference space on the floor below the penthouse, with Marco and two of the family's most senior analysts when the confirmation arrived. Dominic Ferro, acting on orders from the Sorrento family's head, Carlo Sorrento, had coordinated the shooting. The actual trigger had been pulled by a professional, ex-military, contracted, already dead in an arrangement that had the signature of thorough housekeeping. The room's temperature did not change. The men at the table looked at Nico. This was the moment. This was the moment where Luca Carbone, or anyone who needed to credibly impersonate him, would deliver a verdict. Not a legal one, not a human one. The kind of verdict that was written in consequences. Nico looked at the report. He looked at the faces around the table. He thought with complete clarity about who he was, what he actually was, separate from the suit and the name and the performance, and what the people in this room needed him to be. He said, Ferro first, then we have a conversation with Carlo Sorrento. And that conversation, Marco began, will result in a new arrangement. Nico looked up. One that recognizes the fact that killing the head of an organization and then trying to continue doing business with that organization is an act of extraordinary stupidity. And that stupidity should be expensive. He let the silence land. Not blood? Sal Donati, from the left of the table, asked. Blood is messy, Nico said. Expensive is permanent. There was a beat. Then Marco said, very quietly, That's actually smarter than what Luca would have done. It was the first time Marco had said anything like that. The acknowledgement floated in the air and then settled. Clean it up, Nico said. Ferro, 2 days. He stood, because Luca always stood to end a meeting, a physical declaration that the conversation had reached its natural conclusion and required no further input from those who'd been permitted to attend. He left the room. In the elevator, alone, he leaned against the wall and closed his eyes. He was giving orders for a man's ruin. He was operating the machinery of consequence, the kind of machinery that, once set in motion, didn't ask his permission to keep running. He was still himself, he told himself, still Nico, still the boy from Queens who memorized Shakespeare for auditions that no one attended, still a person rather than a position. But the person was getting harder to locate. He found Valentina in the study again. She developed the same habit he had, which was slightly absurd and also the most comfortable thing in his life at present. She was reading and looked up when he came in. She read his face. She was extraordinarily good at this. He'd noticed it accumulating over weeks, her ability to decipher his expressions below the level of the performance, to look through Luca's face to the face beneath. It unnerved him. It also, and he was honest enough to acknowledge this, anchored him in a way nothing else did. They found out who did it, she said. Yes. Ferro. Yes. He sat across from her. I gave the order. She put down the book. I know what giving the order means, she said. I know you do. Does it? She stopped, started again. I want to ask you something that you're probably not supposed to answer. Ask. Does it feel like something? The order? Or have you... She looked at him carefully. Have you become enough of him that it doesn't? The question sat between them like a piece of exposed wiring. It feels like something, he said. It feels like something I did rather than something I am. I don't know if that distinction holds. He looked at his hands. I don't know how long the distinction holds. Valentina was quiet. Good, she said finally. He looked up. That it feels like something, she said. That you're tracking it. Her voice was not warm, exactly, but it was careful. The voice of someone handling something fragile with precision. The men in this world who stopped feeling it, that's when they become truly dangerous. To everyone. Is that what happened to Luca? A long pause. Luca, she said, was born into it. He never had a before. You have a before. She picked up her book. Hold on to it. He stayed in the study for another hour, reading without reading. Occasionally he looked at her over the edge of his book, and occasionally she looked at him, and neither of them mentioned it. Petrov noticed. It was inevitable, Nico supposed, in retrospect. Of all the people in the Carbone orbit, Petrov was the sharpest instrument. A man who had survived by reading rooms more accurately than anyone in them, who had worked with Luca Carbone long enough to have internalized the specific grammar of his behavior. A man for whom small inconsistencies were not noise, but signal. He asked for a private meeting. They sat in the study, the room that had become, somehow, the most human space in the penthouse, with 2 glasses of aged scotch that Nico didn't want but poured because Luca would have poured. Petrov looked at him for a long time without speaking. This was his method, the mirror of Nico's own technique, which Nico suspected Petrov had practiced considerably longer. You're different, Petrov said. So I've been told. Not in the ways Marco has been explaining. Not the head injury. He sipped his scotch. Different in here. He tapped his chest. Something essential. Nico held his gaze. You're going to tell me, Petrov continued, his voice light as smoke, that near-death experiences change a man. They do. They do. And yet, he leaned back, I've known men who survived attempts on their lives. They become either more careful or more reckless. They do not become more... He paused, as though the word was at the tip of his tongue. Thoughtful. You prefer reckless? I prefer consistent. He set down his glass. Luca was consistent. Whatever he was, and we needn't romanticize, he was always exactly what he was. There was no drift, no evolution. His eyes were steady. You are drifting. The room was very quiet. Nico said, What are you asking me? Petrov looked at him for another long moment. Then he said, in a different voice, quieter, with the particular quality of someone speaking without the protection of subtext, I am asking whether you are safe. It wasn't the question Nico had expected. Define safe, he said. Are the people around you in danger from your inconsistency? You mean the family? I mean the people who depend on continuity. A pause. I mean Valentina. The mention of her name moved through Nico's chest like a key turning in a lock. Valentina is... He stopped, reorganized. She's well. She's... The arrangement is unchanged. That's not what I asked. I know. The silence stretched. I'll tell you something, Petrov said finally, settling back into something more ordinary. I have been in this world for 30 years. I have seen men destroyed by their own families, by their rivals, by their governments, by their consciences. He picked up his glass. The most dangerous force in this world is not violence. It is attachment. It makes men stupid. It makes them sentimental. It makes them human in ways that are exploitable. He looked at Nico. Be careful what you feel in this place, and who sees you feeling it. He stood. We have nothing further to discuss, he said. And then, with a quality that Nico would spend a long time analyzing, yet. He left. Nico sat in the study with his scotch and understood that he'd just been warned. The question was, about what exactly? The danger of being discovered? The danger of Valentina herself? Or the danger that Petrov, old, pragmatic survivor that he was, had identified in Nico something worth protecting and was doing so in the only language he knew, which was the language of caution. He didn't have an answer. He did have, however, a more acute awareness of Valentina, of the fact that Petrov had mentioned her specifically, which meant she was visible, which meant the particular gravity between them had registered even to someone trained to read rooms. That evening, he found her on the terrace. The penthouse had a terrace on the south side, a sweep of concrete and iron railing above the city, with a view that cost, he'd estimated, approximately 4 years of his previous earnings per square foot. Valentina stood at the railing with a glass of wine, her face tilted slightly upward as though listening for something in the air above the city. He stood beside her. She didn't turn. Petrov. Yes? What did he say? He said I'm drifting. A pause. He's not wrong. She was quiet. Below them the city moved, cabs and buses and the thousand small urgencies of people going somewhere. He said to be careful what I feel. He looked at her profile. And who sees it? Her jaw was very still. He's not wrong about that either. No. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at him from the corner of her eye. What do you feel? She asked. Her voice was very careful. Not cold. Careful, the way you are with something that matters. He thought about honesty. The genuine, unpracticed, actor's instinct kind. Like I'm losing the performance, he said, and like I don't know if I want to find it again. She turned back to the city. That's very dangerous, she said. I know. We should go inside. Yes. Neither of them moved for another 10 minutes. Below them, the city burned with all its indifferent, relentless light, and above it, 2 people stood in the dark and didn't go inside, and understood what that meant without saying it. Enzo Greco arrived in New York on a Tuesday with a retinue of 6 and the particular energy of a man who had never in his life entered a room without calculating whether he was the most powerful person in it. He was 61 years old, white-haired, built like a man who had once been physical and was now simply dense. The density of old money and older violence compressed into an expensive suit. He had Valentina's dark eyes and none of her subtlety, which made him, in Nico's assessment, significantly more dangerous than anyone he'd dealt with so far. Nico met him in the formal dining room, not the kitchen, not the study, not any of the spaces that had accumulated human meaning. The dining room was pure theater, a table that seated 20, lit to flatter power rather than faces. Enzo embraced him, the Mediterranean embrace of men in this world, perfunctory and loaded. And Nico held completely still, returned it correctly, stepped back with precisely 2 feet between them. You look well, Enzo said, evaluating him with those dark eyes. I am well, Nico said. The situation has been managed. I heard. A pause. Faro. Faro, Nico confirmed, and Carlo Sorrento, is now considerably poorer and understands the consequences of further interest in Carbone operations. Enzo's eyes were steady, testing the surface. And the family's position? Unchanged. Nico gestured to the table. Sit. The dinner was Augusto-level theater. 6 courses, attended to with the precision of people who understood that the event's most important element was the management of the guest's sense of power, making him feel that his host was comfortable enough to be gracious, strong enough not to need to be impressive, sovereign enough that the impression was effortless. Nico had prepared for this meeting for 2 weeks. He had memorized every conversation he could find between Luca and Enzo Greco. He knew the specific deference Enzo expected. Not submissive deference, which he would have despised, but the deference of an equal acknowledging a peer. But it was the moment Valentina entered the room that the meeting changed shape. She'd been absent for the first course, a calculated absence, because it established that she arrived on her own terms, which was an assertion of dignity that Nico had insisted on, and Marco had reluctantly endorsed. She wore dark red again. She seemed to favor dark red, a color that looked like a statement of intent. And she crossed the room and kissed her father's cheek with the controlled warmth of a woman who had long since negotiated the precise boundaries of what she would give him. Enzo looked at her with the assessing gaze of a man looking at an investment checking in. Then he looked at Nico. She looks well, he said. She is well, Nico said. She is here, Valentina said pleasantly. Something happened in the room, a very slight reorganization, a microscopic adjustment in posture from the men on both sides of the table. Nico had a sudden, clear understanding of why Valentina's particular skill set had been developed. She had been raised in rooms like this, by a man like this, and she had learned that the only way to exist with dignity in them was to occupy her own authority with such precision that challenging it became more work than it was worth. He watched her across the table and felt something that was not appropriate to feel in a meeting of this kind, which was pride. Enzo addressed her in Italian. She answered in Italian. Nico followed it, mostly. It was family conversation with political subtext. Her health, the penthouse, the engagement timeline, the date they discussed for a formal announcement. She answered everything with measured equanimity, looking at her father with the face that was not the face she wore in the study or the kitchen or the terrace. The face that was armor, specifically fitted for this room. After dinner, Enzo pulled Nico aside. Just the two of them in the hallway outside the dining room, Enzo's men at a discreet distance that still felt closer than it looked. She's my only child, Enzo said, not warmly, factually. The way you state the value of an asset. The arrangement between our families was built on her. I know, Nico said. She is treated with respect, Nico said, and something in his voice, something that had nothing to do with the performance, made Enzo pause. She has full access to everything she needs. She is consulted. She is... He stopped himself before the word he'd almost said. He found a different one. She is valued. Enzo looked at him for a long moment. Luca, he said, was not a man who used words like valued. People change, Nico said. The evaluation in Enzo's eyes was profound and quiet and very fast. He was, Nico understood, a man who had built a career on reading people, and what he was reading now was not quite Luca Carbone. He didn't say so. What he said was, "My daughter is not as manageable as she appears." I know. She observes, she calculates, she will find anything worth finding. I know, Nico said, and then, because something in him insisted, that's not a liability. Enzo's expression shifted, 1 degree, very slightly, in a direction Nico couldn't quite read. No, he said, I suppose it isn't. He left the following morning. Valentina watched his car go from the window and said nothing. Nico stood beside her. He doesn't trust you, she said. No. He doesn't quite distrust you either. She paused. That's actually better than I expected. Your bar is low. My bar, she said, was set by my father and this world. Yes, it is low. She turned from the window. You said I was valued. He'd known she'd heard that. The walls in this building were thicker than most, but not thick enough. I did, he said. She looked at him steadily, with that deep-water gaze that moved with things beneath the surface. Thank you, she said. Then she walked away, and he watched her go, and thought that the bar she'd described might be the saddest thing anyone had ever told him. October had settled over the city with its specific gravity. The light changed, the shadows lengthened, and the penthouse became a different kind of beautiful. Colder, more crystalline, with a quality of clarity that felt like something being stripped away. Nico had been Luca Carbone for 6 weeks. He was good at it now in the way that you become good at anything you do every day of your life. Without the consciousness of effort, the performance settling into something that felt, from the outside, like nature. The family had stopped watching him with the vigilance of the first weeks. Marco still monitored, but with more confidence. Sal Donati had stopped testing. Even Petrov, who Nico suspected would never entirely stop testing, seemed to have arrived at a provisional, watchful equilibrium. The problem was not the performance. The problem was the off-stage. In the penthouse, in the private hours, in the kitchen and the study and the terrace, in the growing habitual life of two people sharing space, Nico Reyes was becoming insufficiently careful. He brought her coffee in the mornings. He'd started this because the machine was near his room, and she worked late, and the gesture was practical. But it had become ritual, which was something else entirely. He asked questions that Luca would never have asked. About her life before this one, about what she read and what she thought, and what she wanted from a world that had organized itself entirely around what other people wanted from her. He asked with the genuine interest of a person to whom she mattered, not as a strategic asset, not as a political variable, but as a human being with an inner life that deserved attention. She answered. This was the more remarkable thing. She answered with an increasing honesty that seemed to surprise her as much as him, as though she'd been so long in the habit of performance that genuine conversation felt like a foreign language she was relearning. She was, he discovered, ferociously intelligent. Not the strategic intelligence she deployed as armor, which was formidable, but a broader, stranger kind. The intelligence of someone who had read everything and absorbed it all and had never quite had a room where that could matter. She'd wanted to study architecture. She told him this one evening, with the particular tone of people describing discontinued paths. Not bitter, not wistful exactly, but with the flat precision of a fact being stated cleanly. Architecture, he said. Structures. How things hold together. The relationship between what's visible and what's hidden. She looked at him. It seemed appropriate. Given your family. Given everything. He looked at her for a long moment, at the woman who had wanted to understand how things hold together and had been herself constructed by her father into a mechanism of political alliance. He thought about the architectural metaphor, about the beauty and the irony of it, about the fact that she was sitting in this penthouse that was itself a kind of structure, all visible authority and hidden load-bearing. I was going to be an actor, he said. You are an actor. I mean before this, not by accident. He paused. I was doing it because I loved it, the becoming of someone else, the access to other lives. I thought it was the closest thing to freedom I knew how to find. And now? Now I've become someone else for real, and it's... He stopped. It's the least free I've ever felt. She was quiet. Is that ironic enough for you? He asked. It's exactly ironic enough. But her voice was soft. It was on a night in late October, a night that had been a standard evening of performance, a dinner at the family's midtown restaurant with 3 visiting capos from Boston, that the crack appeared. They were in the car coming back, Valentina beside him, the city sliding past the windows. She had a tension in her posture that she'd had since the dinner, not the usual management, not the armor, but something more particular. He waited. One of the Boston men, she said finally. Ricci. He made a comment. While you were speaking to the other 2, about... She stopped. About the arrangement. About what women in these families are for. He was very still. What did he say? It doesn't matter specifically. It matters to me. She turned to look at him. Something in his voice had shifted, dropped down out of the Luca register, out of the performance register, into something below both. It was the ordinary kind of contempt, she said carefully. I've heard it my whole life. You should not... He stopped himself. He was aware that what he'd been about to say was something that Luca Carboni would not have said. He reorganized. The Boston men are guests in our house, he said, in the Don's voice, but with Nico's meaning underneath it. They conduct themselves accordingly. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't have to, she began. I know I don't have to. He turned to look at her fully. This close, in the dark of the car, with the city moving outside the windows, the performance felt very thin. I want to. The words landed between them with a weight neither of them was entirely prepared for. She looked at him with those deep water eyes, and in the dark of the car, with the city burning outside the windows, something in her expression changed. A small, careful, almost involuntary change, like a door opening a centimeter. Then she looked away. Thank you, she said, very quietly. When they reached the penthouse and the elevator opened and they stepped out into the space that had become their home, he stopped and she stopped and they stood in the hallway. Valentina, he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything else. He couldn't think of anything that wouldn't be too much or too little. So he simply stood there, and she stood there, and the city moved far below them, and nothing happened, and everything happened. Then she went to her rooms. He stood in the hallway for a long time. The complication came in the form of a woman named Elena Carbone, Luca's younger sister, 30 years old. She arrived unannounced on a Thursday morning, having let herself in with a key she'd apparently retained, despite not having visited the penthouse in 8 months, and was in the kitchen drinking coffee when Nico came in. He stopped in the doorway. She looked exactly like her brother's photographs, the same dark coloring, the same architectural bone structure. But where Luca's face had been a closed door, Elena's was a window. She was expressive, bright, and at this particular moment looking at him with the undivided attention of someone who had identified an anomaly and was thoroughly interested in it. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "Elena," he said, and crossed the kitchen with the measured unhurriedness of someone who had not just experienced a full-body surge of panic. She handed him a coffee. "You look," she said, studying him over her own cup, "different." "I've been told." "No, you look—" She tilted her head. A gesture that was very natural, very unguarded, and absolutely nothing like anything Nico had prepared for, because Elena Carbone had not been in the files. She'd been abroad for 8 months. She had not been a variable. She was now a very significant variable. "You seem—" She paused again. "Kinder," she said. "I know that sounds strange." "Does it?" He kept his voice even. Luca was many things. Kind was not on the list. She sipped her coffee. "I'm not saying this to insult him. It's simply accurate. He was shaped by our father in a specific way." She set down her cup. "I've been in Florence for 8 months. I came back because I heard about the shooting. I came back because—" She stopped. "Because he was your brother," Miko said. Her eyes sharpened. Something moved in them. Not grief exactly, but its close relative, the complicated grief of people whose loves were built on damage. "Because whatever he was," she said, "he was mine." Nico looked at this woman, Luca's sister, grieving in a room with the man who had replaced her brother and could not tell her so, and felt the full weight of what he was doing pressed down on him with a completeness it hadn't managed before. "I'm glad you're here," he said, which was honest. She looked at him for a long moment. "Who are you?" she said, very softly, not accusatory, genuinely wondering. "I'm—" he caught himself. "Different," he said. "The shooting— I know about the shooting." She shook her head. "That's not what I'm asking." He held her gaze and said nothing. She looked at him for another long moment. Then her eyes moved, past him, to the doorway. He turned. Valentina was there. The three of them occupied the kitchen in a triangle of awareness. Elena looking between Nico and Valentina with those quick, expressive eyes. Valentina very still in the doorway with her deep-water gaze moving from Elena to Nico and back. "Elena," Valentina said, and crossed the room and embraced her. "I heard you were coming." "Did you?" Elena held her for a moment. "You look well. Better than I'd expect, given—" "We've managed," Valentina said. Elena pulled back and looked at her with the warmth of someone who has known another person long enough to read through the diplomatic formulations. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." The glance she slid toward Nico was not subtle. He met it. She smiled, a complicated, private smile. "I'm staying for a while," she said. "I hope that's all right." "Of course," Nico said. Later that day, Nico found Marco in the study. "Elena is here," Nico said. "I know." Marco's expression was carefully controlled. "She can't know. She already suspects something." Suspecting and knowing are different things. Keep them different. She loved her brother. She loves the family. Marco looked at him steadily. Those are different things too. Elena Carbone is not naive. She is not going to collapse if the world is not what she thought. But she cannot be told. Not because she can't handle it, but because any additional person who knows is an additional point of exposure. She's going to find out. "Not if you're good." Nico looked at the window. "I'm very good," he said. "That's not the issue." A pause. "The issue is that she's grieving for someone who is gone, and I'm the person who is supposed to pretend that the grief has no object." Marco was quiet. "I know," he said finally. In a different tone, not the operational tone, but something older. "It's ugly work. Most of this is ugly work." He looked at Nico. "You're not the first person in this world to be asked to carry something they didn't ask for." He meant Valentina. He meant Elena. He meant himself, probably. Nico went back to the penthouse and found Elena and Valentina on the terrace. Valentina in her chair with a glass of wine, Elena animated, talking with her hands about Florence, about the light, about a sculptor she'd been studying. Valentina was listening, with an expression Nico had not seen on her before, an expression of uncalculated pleasure in the company of someone whose warmth was simply warm. He stood in the doorway and watched them. He thought, this is what she would look like if she were free. He thought, I want to see that more. He thought, this is a terrible time to want anything. She saw it before she named it. This was characteristic of Valentina. She processed the data before she assigned the vocabulary, which meant she was often several steps ahead of her own conclusions, carrying knowledge she hadn't yet permitted herself to articulate. What she saw was the small things. The way he stood at the window in the mornings. Not the calculated stance of performance, but the habitual stance of a person thinking, weight slightly uneven, one hand loose at his side, eyes moving across the city with a quality that was private and genuinely curious rather than surveilling. The way he laughed, rarely, in public, never, but occasionally in the kitchen or the study, something would catch him and the laugh would come, brief and completely undefended, and for a moment Luca Carbone's face would disappear and some other face would show through. A younger face, a face that found things funny. The way he looked at her. She named this last. He looked at her the way she had not been looked at in the 5 years since she had entered this world at her father's side. Not with assessment, not with calculation, not with the proprietorial gaze of men in this world, for whom a beautiful woman was a display of power. He looked at her with a quality she could only describe as attention, genuine, unhurried, specifically interested in her, rather than in what she represented or what she could provide. It was devastating. She recognized this clearly and with full intellectual awareness, the way you might recognize that you are standing at the edge of something, not because you're not careful, but because careful and unhurt are no longer the same thing. He was not Luca. He had never been Luca. He was Nico, whoever Nico was. A young man from somewhere ordinary who had been dropped into a life built for someone else and was navigating it with a combination of intelligence, discipline, and an essential kindness that was so genuine it was almost absurd in these surroundings. She thought about what her life had been before. Her father's house in Chicago, marble and silk and the constant thrum of political machinery. The men who had been presented to her as potential alliances before Luca, men who had looked at her with the evaluating eyes of investors. The engagement, 6 months of dinners with a man who was precisely what he was, which was a force rather than a person. And now this, a penthouse on Park Avenue, a life she hadn't chosen, a name she wore like borrowed clothing, and a man who brought her coffee and asked her about architecture and had, with calm deliberateness, communicated to a room of powerful men that she was valued. She thought about Petrov's warning, his careful, strategic warning, which had been about attachment and exposure and the way that feeling made people exploitable. She thought about her father, who had raised her to be useful, strategic, never sentimental. She thought about all of this with the clarity of a woman who had been educated by a world that rewarded clear eyes. And she arrived at a conclusion that was both simple and complicated. She was falling in love with a man who didn't exist. Not the man in the suit, not Don Carbone. Nico, the person underneath the performance. The person who was losing the performance precisely because he was becoming too present, too actual, too himself in a role that had been designed for someone else. She lay awake on a Thursday night and thought about this with characteristic precision. The danger was not just personal. He had said it himself. The performance was becoming harder to find. She could see it in the fine details. Moments in meetings where something genuine flickered through the Luca mask. Moments where the warmth or the curiosity or the very ordinary humanity of him surfaced in a room full of people trained to read exactly those signals. Petrov had already noticed. Elena had already noticed, or was noticing. There was also the more primary danger. If she loved him and it was discovered, she became leverage. In this world, the people you loved were the handles by which other people moved you. Her father had taught her that by example, by being a man who loved only power, who was therefore ungovernable. She had internalized the lesson. She had not loved Luca, and the absence of love had been a form of protection. Now, she turned over in the dark. Now she went to the kitchen at 7 in the morning, and there was already coffee made. Now she came to the study, and he was reading her mother's books. Now she stood at windows with him, and didn't go inside when she should. She was not, she told herself firmly, going to do this. Then she thought about the car, coming back from the Boston dinner. The shift in his voice. I want to. Not I will, not I should. I want to. She lay in the dark for a long time. Then she got up, put on a robe, and went to the kitchen. He was there. Of course he was there. It was 3 in the morning, and they were both, apparently, insomniacs held together by the same particular gravity. He looked up from the book he was reading at the kitchen island, looked at her with that look, the attention. Can't sleep, he said. No. She sat down across from him. He made tea without being asked. He'd figured out somewhere in the past weeks that she drank tea when she couldn't sleep, which was the kind of detail that people only notice when they are paying attention. She sat with her tea. He sat with his book. They didn't talk. It was the most intimate thing that had happened to her in 5 years. The fracture happened at a gala. The Carbone Foundation, a legitimate charity operation that the family used for both genuine philanthropy and strategic visibility, held its annual autumn gala at the Metropolitan Club. 500 guests, 3 senators, a mayor, and every significant figure in the family's legitimate and less legitimate orbit, dressed in black and jewels, and the specific armor of people for whom public events were another kind of warfare. Nico had been to 3 public events by this point. He was, by all measures, good. But there was something about the density of this crowd, the number of variables, 500 people who knew Luca's face, 500 different relationships and expectations and histories, that applied a pressure his performance hadn't yet met at this scale. He stood at the entrance to the main hall with Valentina at his side and felt, with specific clarity, that the next 3 hours were going to require everything he had. She sensed it. She touched his arm, the smallest touch, through the fabric of his jacket sleeve, just above the elbow. Not romantic, not even intimate, technically. Just a touch that communicated, I'm here, I see you, hold on. He exhaled. They walked in. The first 2 hours were the elaborate social machinery of these events, the greetings, the photographs, the particular theater of public unity. Valentina was extraordinary at this. She moved through the room with a grace that was both innate and disciplined, managing a conversation with one person while maintaining peripheral awareness of 3 others, navigating social dynamics with the precision of a chess player running multiple games simultaneously. He watched her whenever he could. The fracture came at 11:15, in the form of a man named Thomas Harlow. Harlow was a city councilman with ambitions that required, among other things, continued goodwill from the Carbone family. He was not a subtle man. He had, according to Nico's files, made a consistent practice of ensuring that Valentina's contributions to any conversation she was present for were professionally undervalued. A practice, the files noted, that Luca Carbone had overlooked because it was not strategically relevant. Nico watched Harlow spend 4 minutes talking to 3 other men in Valentina's presence, while directing no comment to her, then turned to address her directly with, "And how is the domestic side? The engagement going smoothly?" Valentina's face didn't change. "Beautifully," she said, in a tone that was smooth as a blade. "Wonderful. These things can be complex. Managing a household at this level, the social obligations—" "Valentina," Nico said. He hadn't planned to speak. Or rather, Don Carbone hadn't planned to speak. Nico spoke, and the distinction was right there on the surface. Every face in the small cluster turned toward him. He looked at Harlow with the geological stare, but underneath it, something was live and not cold at all. "Was involved," he said pleasantly, with the measured cadence of someone choosing each word the way you choose which thread to pull. "In the negotiation structure for the Greco-Carbone arrangement. Was present at the meetings with the Chicago office. Is," he paused, "the most significant strategic intelligence in this room." He smiled the small smile. "Were you unaware?" Harlow's face went through several changes in rapid succession. "Of course," he said finally. "Of course, I meant—" "I'm sure you did," Nico said. He turned back to Valentina. She was looking at him with an expression that was entirely new. Not the deep water look, not the armor. Something more open. Something that looked like being seen. He offered his arm. She took it. They moved away from Harlow. In the small anteroom at the edge of the hall, a brief, necessary retreat, 2 minutes between performances, she turned to him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know. It creates questions about why you would—" "I know." She looked at him. Up close, in the anteroom light, with the gala noise beyond the door, her eyes were doing the thing, the movement beneath the surface, but this time the thing underneath was closer to the surface than he'd seen it. "Nico," she said, very quietly. "Not Luca." "Nico." "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up, a careful, deliberate gesture, and straightened the fold of his jacket lapel, which had been perfectly straight. It was the most she'd touched him. It wasn't much. It was everything. Elena found him in the study at midnight. He'd expected this, in the way you expect things you've been avoiding, with the weariness of the anticipated. She came in and closed the door and sat across from him, and looked at him with those quick, expressive eyes that had been doing their assessment since she'd arrived. "Tell me," she said. No preamble. He looked at her. This woman who had lost her brother, the real one, without ever being allowed to grieve him, because the machinery of family required the fiction of his survival. And here she sat in a room with the man occupying that fiction, asking him to tell her. He said, "Elena, don't." Her voice was not angry. It was something more final than anger. "Don't tell me again about the head injury and the changed personality and the—" She stopped. Her hands, on the table, were very still. "I have known my brother since the day I was born. I was there when our father beat him for the first time. I was there when he got the scar on his left hand, the one that's on your hand." She looked at him steadily. "Except it's slightly different. The angle is different." He was very still. She continued in the same quiet voice. "I have also known, for the last 3 weeks, that something was wrong. Not wrong, different. Something—" She stopped again, and this time when she started again, her voice was careful in a different way, careful with itself. "Something better was in that room." He held her gaze. "Luca was my brother," she said, "and I loved him because he was mine, but he was—" Her jaw moved. "He was becoming our father, and I had been watching it happen for years, and I couldn't stop it. I tried. He didn't want to be stopped." She looked at her hands. "I left because I couldn't watch anymore." The silence was profound. "When he was killed," she said, She stopped. "I had already grieved. I had been grieving him for years. The man I knew as a child was gone a long time before whoever did this." She stopped again. Nico waited. "I need to know," she said finally. "I need to know what happened, and I need to know who you are." He made a decision. He told her. Not everything, not the operational details, not the family's internal mechanics, nothing that would put her in more danger than she was already in. But the shape of it, who he was, what had been asked of him, what the alternative had been, how the weeks had gone. She listened without speaking. When he was done, the room was very quiet. "Valentina knows," she said. It wasn't a question. "From the beginning." "Is she—" She seemed to be choosing words with unusual care. "Is she all right?" "She's—" He thought about this honestly. "She's navigating it, the way she navigates everything." Elena looked at him, a long, searching look. "And you?" she said. "Are you all right?" He hadn't been asked this. Not once in all the weeks since the men in black suits arrived. Not by Marco, who was too pragmatic. Not by Valentina, who was too careful. Not by anyone in this building. Something in his chest shifted, a small, structural thing, like a wall bearing weight it shouldn't, and recognizing, briefly, that it is a wall. "No," he said honestly, "not entirely." She nodded, not with pity, with a kind of blunt recognition that was its own form of respect. "I'm not going to tell anyone," she said. "Elena, I'm not, and not because you've threatened me, or because of the family, or because of whatever Marco would say about operational security. She looked at him with those eyes that were her brother's eyes, and completely unlike them. Because whatever this is, whatever you're doing here, it's the first time in 3 years someone has done right by Valentina. He didn't answer that. She doesn't let people in, Elena said. My father taught her that safety and distance are the same thing. She learned it so well she forgot there's a cost. She paused. I've known Valentina for 6 years. I've seen her be brilliant and competent and completely alone in rooms full of people. She looked at him. She looks at you differently. How? Elena's smile was complicated. Like you're the first real thing in a long time. She stood. Be careful, she said, both of you. Not because I'm warning you, because you deserve to survive this. She left. He sat in the study for a long time, with the books that had belonged to a dead woman and the city burning far below, and held the weight of everything. The storm broke in November. Not the metaphorical one. The actual one arrived first, a nor'easter that drove rain at the windows with a sound like static, turning the city below into something impressionistic and remote. The penthouse in the storm was a different thing, more sealed, more specific, the outside world pushed back to the windows. It was in this atmosphere, sealed, specific, the outside world held at the glass, that Petrov returned. He came alone. This was, Marco told Nico afterward, unprecedented. He came at 9 in the evening and sat in the study across from Nico and Valentina. She was there when he arrived and showed no indication of leaving, and set his hands on his knees and said, I need to tell you both something that I've known for 3 weeks and have been deciding what to do with. Nico held very still. I know you are not Luca Carbone, Petrov said. The storm drove at the windows. I knew within the first week, Petrov continued, in the same careful, even voice. The scar, the manner, the specific absence of certain reflexes that Luca had built over 30 years. But more than any of these, you make choices that Luca would not have made. Not just different choices, better ones. He looked at Nico steadily. The Sorrento situation, the way you handled Enzo Greco, his eyes moved briefly to Valentina and back. The way you've managed the internal culture of the family. Luca would have handled these things with violence and spectacle. You've used intelligence and economy. The results have been substantially superior. A beat. So, Nico said carefully. So I've been watching and deciding. Petrov's hands were still on his knees, the posture of a man who is being deliberately transparent. I've known Luca Carbone for 11 years. He was a specific and effective instrument. He was also, and I say this without relish, becoming unstable in ways that would eventually have endangered the family. His judgment had been deteriorating for 2 years. His response to the Sorrento provocation would likely have started a war. He looked between them both. Whoever arranged this, he glanced upward, which Nico took to mean Marco, or the structural decision-making above Marco, made a calculation I understand. And your decision? Nico asked. My decision, Petrov said, is that the Carbone family is more stable now than it has been in 3 years. The operation is cleaner, the alliances are sounder, the risks are better managed. He paused. And so I will do what I've done for 30 years, what I do for the organization, not for individuals, not for names. He looked at Nico with those steady, intelligent eyes. You have my support, for as long as you are what you have been. And if I'm not? I will do what I always do, Petrov said simply. Protect the operation. He stood. He looked at Valentina. I said once, he told her, to be careful of attachment. His voice was different now, quieter. I said it because I have seen it destroy people. I stand by the warning. A pause. But I have also lived 30 years in this world and watched people sacrifice everything that matters for the sake of survival and arrive at the end of it with nothing but the survival. He seemed to be looking at something beyond the room. That is also a kind of destruction. He looked back at her. Choose carefully, but, the smallest pause, don't only choose safely. He left. The storm drove at the windows. Nico and Valentina sat in the study in the space that Petrov had left, a space that had been cleared of some obstruction, some formal barrier, something that had existed between them as a structure of caution. She was very still. He's right, she said. It's dangerous. Yes, For you most of all. She looked at him. If anyone thinks that you are compromised by, that the Dawn's judgment is affected by, I know. Nico. It was the name. Not the role, not the performance, the name. I know, he said again, softer. She stood, crossed the room, stopped directly in front of him. Up close. Closer than they'd been since the anteroom at the gala, closer than the car, closer than any of the moments that had been accumulating into something neither of them had named. She put her hand on his face. The gesture was simple, her palm against his jaw. Nothing theatrical, just contact. Just a human hand on a human face, in a room during a storm, in a life that belonged to someone else. He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, she was looking at him with those deep water eyes, and the thing beneath the surface was fully visible now. She'd let it come up. She wasn't hiding it. She was choosing not to hide it, which was different and much more significant. I see you, she said, very quietly. Not him, you. He thought, I have been performing for 11 weeks, and she is the only thing that has ever made me feel real. He said, Valentina. Don't say anything careful, she said. Not tonight. He reached up and covered her hand with his, the hand on his face, held it there. They stayed like that for a while, in the storm. It was not a kiss. It was not an act. It was two people who had been admitting, privately, to something true. She was in the kitchen when he woke up. Not because he'd gone to her room or she'd come to his. Nothing had happened in that direction. Not yet. As though both of them understood instinctively that the threshold once crossed would change the geometry of everything, and required, therefore, a specific readiness that the storm had not quite produced. What had happened was simpler and stranger. They'd sat in the study until nearly 2 a.m, talking. Actually talking. Not the careful bilateral information exchange they'd been conducting for weeks, with its implicit understanding that honesty was being calibrated. But the kind of talking that happens when something is admitted, the talking that fills in the shapes of people. He'd told her about Queens, about his mother, who had worked double shifts at a hospital and arrived home at midnight, smelling of antiseptic, and still asked about his auditions, about the stage, which had been the first place he'd ever felt like his own person, rather than a variable in someone else's equation, about the particular loneliness of loving something, acting, the theater, the pure physics of becoming, that the world assigned no real value to. She told him about Florence, which she'd visited once at 15 with her mother, before her mother was sick. About standing in the Uffizi, in front of Botticelli's Primavera, and feeling, for the first and one of the very few times in her life, that the world contained beauty that existed for its own sake, rather than for any human purpose. About architecture. About the gap between what she'd wanted and what she'd been shaped into. They talked until the storm wound down, and the city below slowly reappeared, wet and glittering. Now he came into the kitchen, and she was making breakfast, actually making it, not summoning it, with her hair loose and a cashmere sweater and bare feet on the cold kitchen tile, and she looked up when he came in. "Morning," she said. The word had never been so ordinary and so loaded simultaneously. "Morning," he said. He sat at the island. She put coffee in front of him. His coffee, exactly right, which she'd figured out sometime in the past weeks, the same way he'd figured out her tea. "Marco called," she said. "There's a meeting at noon." "What kind?" "Operational. Something about the port situation." She turned back to the stove. "Petrov will be there." "Petrov is on our side." The hour, which he hadn't planned, settled into the air between them. She didn't flinch from it. "Yes," she said. "I know." He watched her move around the kitchen, the easy, unself-conscious competence of someone doing something small and domestic, without performance, without armor, without the need for any of the elaborate structural protections she usually deployed. This was the thing he'd been falling toward since the first morning in this kitchen. Not the beauty or the intelligence or the precision, though all of those were real. The ease. The moments when she forgot to be anything other than herself. "What happens," he said, carefully, "when this ends?" She was quiet for a moment. She set down what she was doing and turned to face him. When it ends, she said, depends on how it ends. If it ends well, if the family stabilizes, if the question of Luca's absence is managed. Then, she said, the woman who was Luca Carboni's fiancé becomes the woman who was Luca Carboni's fiancé, which has a specific set of implications in this world. She looked at him, and the man who performed the role disappears. The word disappears. Yes, he said. She looked at him steadily. Is that what you want? To disappear? It was a question he hadn't permitted himself, not in any of the weeks since Queens, since the men in black suits, since all of it. He'd been so focused on the performance, on the survival, on the immediate gravity of each day, he hadn't allowed himself to think past it. He thought about it now. He thought about Nico Reyes, the apartment, the theater, the grease paint, the water stain shaped like Italy. He thought about the life that had been waiting for him on that Thursday night before the car arrived, a life small enough that the men in black suits had found him in it without difficulty. He thought about Valentina in the kitchen with bare feet. No, he said honestly. She nodded, slowly, as though that answer had been stored somewhere and confirmed something. Then, she said, just as carefully, we should think about what happens when it ends. She turned back to the stove. Together. It wasn't a declaration. It was a statement of intent. Private, architectural, the way she thought. Here is the structure. Here is the load it must bear. Here is how we build it to hold. He said, yes. The city outside was clean from the rain. In an hour, he would be Don Carbone at a noon meeting, navigating the permanent chess game of a world built on power and threat. He would be still and cold and inarguable, and precisely positioned in the particular authority of a dead man's name. But in the kitchen, for this hour, he was Nico, having coffee, made exactly right. Watching a woman with bare feet and loose hair and deep water eyes who had said together as though it were the simplest and most obvious thing. Maybe it was. His name was Vincent Sorrento, not Carlo Sorrento, the elder, whose punishment had been financial and whose humiliation had been quiet. This was Carlo's son, 29 years old, recently elevated to captain within the Sorrento family, and possessed of a particular kind of dangerous energy. The energy of men who have grown up in the shadow of their fathers' names, and are reaching for recognition in the one language they know: violence. He'd been watching Nico for weeks. Marco's people confirmed it on a Wednesday. Surveillance, professionally conducted, but not professionally enough to hide from men who'd been in this business long enough. He thinks, Marco said in the study, with the door closed, that you're vulnerable. Because of Luca's shooting. Because of the shooting, and because of certain intelligence that reached him. Marco's voice was careful. Intelligence about changes in the Don's conduct. Nico was very still. What kind of changes? The Sorrento family has people in the periphery of the family. Not inner circle, we've audited that, we're confident. But peripheral, service staff, drivers. He paused. Someone has been reporting on behavioral patterns, inconsistencies. The air in the room was very precise. What specifically? Nico said. The softening, as they're calling it. The Don who doesn't make threats. The Don who has dinner with his fiancée and reads books in the study. Marco looked at him. In this world, those details read as weakness. They're not weakness. I know that. The results know that. But the story of a crime boss who is... Marco paused. Who appears to have become human. That story is a liability. Because human means vulnerable. Because human means there are handles. Vincent Sorrento had evidently decided to test one of the handles. 2 days later, a man who drove for the Carbone family, a peripheral figure, exactly as Marco had described, low enough in the hierarchy that he moved through the edges of things, was found to have been approached by Sorrento people. Not with violence, with money and a question. What did the Don's fiancée's daily schedule look like? The question arrived at Marco's desk before it arrived anywhere dangerous. Nico sat with this information for 4 hours. Then he did something that was not in the performance manual. He told Valentina. He told her directly, in the kitchen at 7 in the evening, with Elena absent and the security staff at their stations and the two of them alone in the specific privacy they built around themselves. He told her with the same clear, unvarnished directness she'd requested from the beginning. No performance. Not here. She heard it. She was quiet for a moment. "They're going to use me," she said. "They want to use the threat of you, which isn't the same thing." He looked at her. "It means we adjust. Your movement patterns, security detail, visibility. It means I become more caged. Temporarily." She looked at her hands. "I've been in a cage my whole life," she said. The words were flat, not bitter, simply true. "Different cages. My father's house, this engagement. Now..." She stopped. "I'm sorry," he said. "Don't apologize. I know Luca didn't apologize." He held her gaze. "I'm not Luca. I'm sorry you're in this. I'm sorry you've always been in something like this. He stopped himself. "I will fix it. Or..." He caught the grandiosity of that. "I will do what I can." She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and clear simultaneously. "You could leave," she said suddenly. "What?" "You could leave. You've done what they asked. The family is stable. The transition has held. You could..." She seemed to be forcing herself to say it. "You are not obligated to keep doing this. You were never really given a choice, but there are exits. Marco could arrange..." "I'm not leaving," he said, very simply, no performance. She was quiet. "Valentina," he said, "I'm not leaving." She looked at him for a long time. "The Sorrento boy," she said finally, "is going to become a real problem." "I know." "You're going to have to deal with him in the language he understands." "I know." "You'll hate it." "Probably." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Don't do it alone. Tell me what you're planning. Let me..." She paused. "I have information about the Sorrento family that I've collected over 5 years because my father wanted intelligence and I was better at gathering it than anyone he employed." She met his eyes. "Let me be useful. Not as a target. As a partner," he said. She considered the word. "Yes," she said, "a partner." He had a meeting with Marco the following morning, in which he laid out the response to the Sorrento situation. It was precise, layered, and deeply uncomfortable for him in the way that the operations of this world always were. But it was also, he was aware, effective in ways that the purely violent response would not have been. He used Valentina's intelligence throughout, woven into the strategy without attribution, because her value was doubled by being invisible. When it was done, Marco looked at him for a long moment. "The Sorrento boy," Marco said. "He's going to find out he made a mistake. That's the point. And the family's red on you will be what it should be." Marco nodded. Then, in a voice stripped of operational weight, "You're doing well." A pause. "Better than he did, in some of the ways that matter." Nico didn't answer that, but he thought about it for the rest of the day. December arrived, and with it a particular kind of reckoning. It had been 2 months. 2 months of performance. 2 months of the elaborate daily theater of being someone else. 2 months of a life that had begun, with unstoppable organic logic, to feel like his own. The Sorrento situation had been resolved, not with blood, though blood had been implied, which was sometimes more effective than the thing itself. Vincent Sorrento had been made to understand, through a cascade of business reversals and social humiliations so precisely calibrated that they had the signature of a skilled operator rather than a blunt instrument, that the Carbone family was not soft, that the changes in its leadership were not weakness, that the new language was precision rather than spectacle. Vincent Sorrento had, according to Marco's intelligence, been arguing with his father for 3 weeks about the miscalculation. The family's position was, by all measures, stronger than it had been in years. Nico sat with this knowledge and understood its full implication. The fiction had succeeded, so thoroughly, so completely, that the question of what happened next had become very real. He brought it to Marco on a Tuesday morning. "It's been 2 months," he said. "The family is stable. The threats have been addressed. The alliances are sounder." He looked across the desk. "What's the exit?" Marco looked at him with the expression of someone who had been thinking about this and had not arrived at an answer he liked. The exit, Marco said carefully, is complex. Because there isn't one. Because the exit requires explaining where Luca went, which requires a story. He paused. Which we have been constructing, slowly. He folded his hands on the desk. A medical situation. Private. The kind of thing powerful families manage privately. A transition of authority, formal, documented, to a successor. He looked at Nico. The transition would, necessarily, involve Luca Carbone stepping back from active leadership while he dies, Nico said. While the record reflects a natural conclusion. Marco's voice was flat. It takes time. We are talking about 3 to 6 months, minimum. A year is more realistic. A year. And in the meantime? In the meantime, you continue. Nico was quiet. There is also, Marco said, in a careful tone that Nico had learned to identify as the tone of something significant being navigated toward, the matter of the arrangement with the Greco family. Valentina. The engagement. The alliance. Marco looked at him steadily. The engagement has certain formal implications. If Luca, as the record will eventually reflect, is incapacitated or gone, the Greco alliance needs to be reaffirmed on different terms. Terms that... He stopped. Terms that involve who she marries, Nico said. Yes. The conversation that followed was the most important operational discussion Nico had engaged in since the beginning, more important, in its way, than any of the meetings with capos or rivals or visiting powers. Because at its center was a question that was not about the family's power structure, but about a woman's life. And the answer to that question mattered to him, in a way that the answer to no previous question had. He said, the alliance is sound. The Greco family's interests are served. The terms don't need to change. Marco looked at him. You're suggesting, Marco said slowly, that the engagement continues under whatever framework we construct. And Valentina has been consulted. Marco was quiet for a long moment. Has she? He said. She has. And she agrees, Nico said. Which was, he acknowledged to himself, a somewhat forward statement of a conversation that had not yet fully happened. But it was based on a reasonable extrapolation of available data, and he intended to make it true before the end of the day. He found her on the terrace. The December cold had given it a different character, cleaner, starker, the city below stripped of its summer softness. She stood at the railing with her coat and her dark hair lifting slightly in the wind. He stood beside her. I told Marco the engagement continues, he said. She turned to look at him. I told him you'd agreed, he continued, which was premature. I apologize for that. But He stopped, reorganized. I wanted it to be true. She watched him. There are 1,000 reasons, he said, that it's a terrible idea. The complications are enormous. The risks are real. The world we're in is... He looked at the city. The world we're in is not one that rewards the kind of... He stopped again. Honesty, she said. Yes. Or vulnerability. Yes. Or the particular catastrophic foolishness, she said softly, of caring about something. He looked at her. I know all of that, she said. I've known it my whole life. I have been the smartest person in every room about exactly why this is dangerous and unwise and... She stopped. And I am standing here thinking about what Petrov said, about arriving at the end of survival with nothing but the survival. She was very still. I don't want that. Neither do I. She turned to face him fully. Her eyes were very dark in the December light. Nico, she said. Yes. I would like to tell you something as myself. Not as the Don's fiancée, not as Enzo Greco's daughter, not as any role. Her voice was quiet and very steady. As Valentina. Tell me. I love you, she said. Simply, without performance, without the architecture of strategic communication. Just the truth, clean and load-bearing. He reached out and took her face in his hands, and when he kissed her, it was not the kiss of Don Carbone, not the kiss of power or authority or possession. It was the kiss of Nico Reyes, who had grown up in Queens and loved the theater, and had come to this life by accident, and found, in the middle of the most elaborate performance of his existence, something that was entirely, irrevocably real. The city burned below them. The cold pressed close. And they stayed on the terrace until they were too cold to stay, and went inside together, and the door closed on the world outside. January. The new year arrived like a verdict. The plan, as Marco had constructed it over the preceding weeks, was elegant in the way that all Marco's plans were elegant, practically sound, emotionally absent, and likely to work. It moved in stages. Luca Carbone's health deterioration, communicated to the outer circles with appropriate gravity. A quiet restructuring of the family's leadership to distribute operational authority while the Don's condition was managed privately. A transition timeline that stretched over months, each stage documented and calibrated to minimize both disruption and suspicion. It would end, eventually, with the formal dissolution of the Luca Carbone identity, a death, recorded in whatever way was most useful, and the emergence of the person who had been doing the work under a different name. What that name was, and what structure it would inhabit, was still being constructed. But before any of that, before the architecture of the exit, there was Enzo Greco. He arrived in January with less ceremony than his previous visit, but more substance. He came with two of his senior people and a lawyer and a specific agenda. He was, Marco informed Nico, aware that something had shifted, not in the criminal sense, not yet, but in the softer intelligence that powerful men gathered through decades of reading rooms. He knew that the Carbone operation had changed character. He was here to decide whether the change served his interests. The meeting was in the formal dining room again. Valentina was at the table. This time, by Nico's specific arrangement, she was not at the periphery, not the decorative attachment, the political piece on the board. She was seated beside him, at the actual table of decision, with the implicit understanding communicated by his posture and his handling of the room that she was present as an intelligence, not as a symbol. Enzo Greco noticed immediately. He noticed and said nothing, which was its own form of communication. The meeting ran for 3 hours. It covered the port operations, the Chicago connections, the formal engagement timeline, all the material substance of the alliance. Nico presented each element with the precision that had become characteristic of his management, the economy that came from using intelligence rather than force, the long-game thinking that was, he recognized without self-congratulation, actually better than what Luca had been doing. Twice, on points of specific detail about the Chicago operations, Nico turned to Valentina. She spoke, not as a prop or a translator, as an expert, clean, specific, irreversible. The second time she spoke, Enzo looked at her for a long moment with an expression that Nico had not seen on his face before, and took a moment to identify. It was surprise. Not offensive surprise. The surprise of a man encountering something he'd known was there, but had never permitted himself to look at directly. After the formal session, Enzo asked for a private word with Nico. They stood in the hallway outside the dining room, in the same position they'd occupied in October. But the atmosphere was different. The evaluation in Enzo's eyes had changed character. "My daughter," Enzo said. "Yes?" "She has been here, active, involved." "Yes." "That is," he paused, "that was not the arrangement." Nico looked at him steadily. "The arrangement was for an alliance between our families. The alliance is functioning better than it has since its inception." He paused. "The mechanism of how it functions is my responsibility." Another pause. "And hers." Enzo's expression was very still. "She is not a mechanism," Nico said quietly. "She is the most operationally valuable intelligence I have. She has also—" He stopped, chose the next words with care. "She has agreed to continue the engagement under the new terms we are constructing. That agreement was freely given." Enzo looked at him. "You love her," he said. It wasn't quite an accusation. It was more like a man updating a variable in an equation that he'd been running for a long time. "Yes," Nico said. "That's—" Enzo stopped. "Dangerous," Nico supplied. I know. I've been told. I was going to say unexpected. A silence. She was told her whole life, Nico said carefully, to be useful, to be strategic, to treat affection as a liability. He held Enzo's gaze. She has carried that for 24 years, and she has carried it with more grace than anyone should be asked to carry anything. Enzo was very quiet. I am not asking for your approval, Nico said. I am telling you who your daughter is and how she will be treated. The silence that followed was long enough to have been dangerous. Enzo Greco looked at this young man, who was not quite what he had thought he was, in a hallway outside a room where his daughter had just demonstrated a competence that Enzo recognized, with the specific, late-arriving clarity of a parent who has looked at his child through the lens of his ambitions for too long, was extraordinary. She has her mother's intelligence, Enzo said, very quietly, not to Nico, to himself. Nico said nothing. Her mother, Enzo continued, still in that quiet voice, was the only person I was ever afraid of disappointing. He seemed to surface from whatever private place that had taken him. He looked at Nico. Don't disappoint her, he said. He walked back into the dining room. Later, when everyone had gone and the penthouse was quiet, Valentina found Nico in the study. My father spoke to you, she said. Yes. What did he say? He thought about how to render the scene honestly. He said, don't disappoint you, he said. Her breath was very still. He also, Nico said gently, said you have your mother's intelligence. She was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful in a way that told him the care was holding something significant. He's never said anything like that to me, she said. I know. She sat down. He sat across from her. The study with its books and its city view and its accumulated hours of two people being real with each other. Things are changing, she said. Yes. It's going to get harder before it gets simpler. Yes. She looked at him. Are you ready? He thought about Queens, the grease paint, the men in black suits, the elevator and the marble, and the woman at the window with her back to the room. He thought about where he was now. I've never been ready for anything that mattered, he said. I've just shown up and done the work. She smiled. Not the diplomatic smile, not the armor smile, the real one, small and private and extraordinary. Then show up, she said. Every day, he said. Spring came to the city the way it always comes, not in one arrival, but in accumulation, 100 small evidences. The particular slant of light at 6 in the morning, the return of warmth to the stone surfaces, the reopening of windows that had been sealed through the winter. Nico noticed all of it. This had become characteristic of him, the specific noticing of a person who has been in proximity to loss long enough to understand that the ordinary world is not, in fact, ordinary. The light at 6, the smell of rain on Park Avenue, the way the city sounds when the windows are open. He was still Luca Carboni in the corridors of the family's operations. The transition plan was moving, slowly, with Marco's characteristic precision, the narrative of the Don's health being managed through the family's channels with the kind of care that created story without crisis. There were months still to go, possibly a year. The machinery of this world did not move quickly when it moved safely. But he was also, increasingly, himself. Not Nico the actor who had walked into this life by accident. Not the young man from Queens performing a role until his hand stopped shaking. Something between those two things, and also beyond them. A person who had been genuinely changed by what he'd been through, had absorbed its costs and its knowledge, and emerged with a different shape. He thought about this on a Tuesday morning in April, while standing at the window with his coffee, looking at the city below. And Valentina came and stood beside him without speaking, and they looked at the city together in the early light. She had changed too, not in the ways the world around her could see. She was still, in the rooms that required it, the composed and strategic figure she'd always been. But in the penthouse, in the private life they'd built with such care and such unlikely luck, she was also more fully herself than she'd been in years. Maybe ever. She'd started sketching again, Architectural drawings, lines and structures, the beautiful logic of buildings, filling pages of a sketchbook she kept in the study among Luca's mother's books. She'd called an old professor from a program she'd briefly attended before her father's machinery had redirected her. She'd started talking, carefully and with appropriate caution, about what came after. After was a word that had begun to exist. Elena was still in residence. She'd become, over months, something that Nico hadn't expected and couldn't have anticipated. A genuine anchor. She understood the truth and held it with remarkable steadiness, engaging with Nico as himself, as a person she'd come to like, which was its own unexpected gift, while understanding the external requirements. She brought levity to a life that had precious little of it. She also, quietly and consistently, had been saying her goodbyes to the brothers she was still mourning in private. Nico thought about Luca Carboni, the real one, the dead one, with a complicated regularity that he suspected would never entirely resolve. He had inhabited this man's name and face and authority for months. He'd held the family together under that name. He'd made decisions that had consequences for real people, living and otherwise. The moral weight of that was not something that admitted simple accounting. He tried to do it well. That was the only thing he knew how to offer, the attempt to do it well. In March, he'd held a private meeting with Petrov that had involved, for the first time, a direct discussion of the transition plan. Petrov had listened, asked 3 precise questions, confirmed his support, and said, "When this ends, the performance part, what happens to you?" "I don't know yet." "You have managed this family better than its actual head," Petrov said. "That is not nothing. In a world that operates on competence, your competence is a fact. What name it operates under is," he paused, "flexible. You're suggesting a legitimate role." "I'm suggesting that legitimate is a word this world uses loosely," Petrov said. "But yes, there are structures, for men who prove themselves." A long pause. "For the right woman beside them." Nico hadn't answered, but he'd thought about it. On a Thursday in late April, the family gathered for a dinner that Marco had organized as a loyalty ceremony, a ritual event, the kind that happened twice a year, at which the family's soldiers and captains affirmed their allegiance. It was, in the old style, a formal and elaborate piece of theater. Nico attended as Luca Carbone for what he believed would be one of the last times. The transition was accelerating. The health narrative had been running for months. The infrastructure of the exit was nearly in place. He stood at the head of the room and looked at the men who had given their loyalty to a name, and thought about what the name meant, and what it had cost, and what was built underneath it. Valentina stood beside him, not behind him, not decoratively to the side, beside. The room understood something in that positioning, in the specific geometry of it, that didn't require articulation. Power in this world communicated in physical space, in the angles of proximity, and the language of who stands where. The men in the room, who had spent their lives reading those signals, read this one. After the dinner, Marco came to him in the private anteroom. 6 months, Marco said. We can have everything in place in 6 months. And then the family has a new structure. The transition is complete. He paused. And you are free, in whatever form makes sense. Free. Such a simple word. So entirely unlike his situation, and yet. He thought about what freedom actually meant. Not the absence of structure, not the return to the water-stained apartment and the dinner theater and the grease paint, but the ability to choose. The ability to be himself in the life he occupied rather than a performance in someone else's. He thought, I have been performing for someone else my whole life. First, the roles I was given on stages that didn't matter. Then the role I was forced into on a stage that mattered entirely. He thought, the difference between those two things is her. She found him afterward, on the terrace. The April night was warm enough to stay out, cool enough to require her coat, and she stood at the railing and looked at the city, and he stood beside her, and they didn't say anything for a while. 6 months, he said. Marco told me. What do you want to do with 6 months? She was quiet. A good quiet, the thoughtful kind, not the guarded kind. I want to go back to Florence, she said. Eventually, not to stay, just to stand in front of the Primavera again. She paused. I want to finish the designs I started, the building. There's a competition I heard about, an international one, for civic architecture. She turned to look at him. I want to enter it. You should. I want... She stopped. In the light from the city, her face was very clear. I want to live in a house that's a house, not a penthouse, not a position. She looked at him. With you. A house, he said. With a kitchen, she said, and the smallest smile was in her voice, where the coffee machine has a manual. He laughed, the laugh he didn't use in public, the real one, brief and undefended and entirely himself. She watched him laugh with an expression that he'd come to understand was one of her private and genuine ones, a look that was warm and wondering and very slightly amazed, as though she was still in the process of believing that something good was actually, factually, improbably occurring. He took her hand. She led him. Below them, the city moved in its endless motion, the cabs and buses and the millions of people going somewhere, carrying their lives and their griefs and their ordinary, extraordinary urgencies. And above it all, on a terrace on the 42nd floor, two people stood in the spring air and held on to each other and let themselves be afraid and real and alive. There was still the work to be done. There was still the machinery to dismantle and reassemble, still 6 months of performance, still the weight of a name that wasn't his and the costs of everything that had happened under it. But there was also this, the city, the night, her hand in his, and the specific, fragile, stubborn fact of two people who had come to this place by separate routes of loss and obligation had found each other in the middle of the most elaborate fiction either of them had ever inhabited, and had chosen, quietly, deliberately, against the advice of every sensible instinct, to be true. Nico Reyes thought, I came here to perform. I thought I understood what that meant. I thought becoming someone else was the closest thing to freedom I knew. I was wrong. This is freedom. Not the absence of constraint or consequence, not the clean, unencumbered life, but this, a person who sees you, whose hand knows the shape of yours, who asks about Florence and architecture and what you want from the world, and who stands at a railing above a city and says your name, your real name, as though it has always been the name she meant. He thought, I have never in my life felt so entirely like myself. He looked at her. She looked at him. The city burned. The night held. And below the penthouse, the world went on with its magnificent, indifferent, relentless business, entirely unaware that somewhere above it, against all probability and at significant personal cost, love had insisted on being ordinary. 6 months later, on a morning in October, when the light came through the windows at a particular angle, Nico and Valentina had breakfast in a kitchen in a house in a neighborhood neither of them had lived in before. The coffee machine required a manual. She'd bought it on purpose. He'd laughed when he saw it, and she'd watched him laugh with that look, the warm, wondering, slightly amazed look, and had said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. The sketchbook on the table was open to a design that had, 3 weeks earlier, placed second in an international competition. The judge's letter described it as structurally innovative and emotionally resonant, a building that understands the relationship between what is visible and what is held. He read the letter every time it was within reach. She pretended not to notice. They had breakfast in the kitchen, and the city was outside the windows, and the world was large and complicated and full of consequence and irreversibility, and none of that was absent from their lives, and none of it mattered the way that morning mattered. He made her coffee. She told him about the new project. He listened. Outside, October. Inside, ordinary, which is the rarest and most luminous thing.